Hello everyone, my name is Robin, and the Volume 9 crew commentary blew the lid off of the secrets and rumors about what happened to Volume 9's production. Lots of things that we have speculated on are outright confirmed now. There's a ton to get through in this video, and I do have a Twitter thread and a Google Doc with all of the information in case you want to read more about this. All of the sources are linked in the description. This video is separated into two parts. First, confirmation of what happened behind the scenes that led to the end of the volume and the production itself being rushed. And the second part, sharing what each episode of the crew commentary had to say about things that got cut, or just generally any insight that I think people ought to know the most. Again, please read my Google Doc or listen to the commentary yourself to get the fullest picture. Most importantly, it's finally officially confirmed that Volume 9 had 12 chapters. Chapter 12 had mostly been an epilogue, and it was entirely cut. It was about 15 minutes long, 6 of which were revealed to the public in that epilogue at RTX 2023. Also, they had confirmed, like I had suspected in my previous video, that chapters 8 through 11 of the original script were condensed and truncated down into being only chapters 8 through 10. There was about 25 minutes of cut runtime across those episodes. The reason why these cuts happened was because of budget and schedule reasons, and they found out they had to make these cuts very late into animating Chapter 7. So in other words, they couldn't spread these cuts out through the first 7 chapters because all of the money already went to those 7 chapters. You're not saving any money by cutting anything down, so because the budget is the issue, the budget can only be resolved with the final few chapters. Like, doing anything to the first 7 chapters wouldn't solve any issue. And so that's why chapters 8 through 10 of Volume 9 feel like they have very rushed pacing, with certain subplots feeling like they're missing entire scenes, because they are. But the end result is one where the crew could only keep the scenes that were absolutely necessary. So now I'm going to read some tweets from Eddy about how the final few chapters of Volume 9 had suffered. He says that chapters 1 through 7 were basically done. The remainder of the volume in animatic form was about 80 minutes, chapters 8 through 12. News came that 80 had to become 40. Any big writing, voice, or boarding changes would eat into that 40 minutes because of money, so chapter 12 got cut outright since it was more epilogue, but that only saved 15 minutes. 25 more minutes had to come out of volumes 8 through 11, which is essentially an episode and a half in RWBY time. Inevitably, there were some cuts with very few right answers in terms of what should be cut over something else. These were done with a lot of painstaking work and debate. There's a lot to second guess, of course, which is natural. It was about as worst case scenario as it gets in terms of the timing, and way beyond the scope of normal issues and cuts that we had run into before. In another tweet, he says that chapters 1 through 7 were basically done and animatics were done for the rest of the volume. Any writing, voicing, or boarding changes meant less minutes of actual animation could be complete to end the volume. I've mentioned before how we learned in the writing stages of Volume 7 that there were production changes and we had to cut an episode. It stinks, but it's much more preferable to what happened in Volume 9, where no writing could be done to fill in the gaps or change things around. And so they had not really said anything about Volume 7's troubles for the longest time because it didn't matter. Volume 7 felt like it stood on its own, and they didn't have any pressure to reveal anything. So in summary, a lot of the damage done to Volume 9 wasn't because of decisions in the writer's room, it wasn't because they had written the volume entirely in this way, it was because they were told to axe about half of the runtime of the final 5 chapters, and they had to turn the final 5 into the final 3. They had to resort to leaving in the scenes that were absolutely necessary and pretty much cut all of the rest. And as twisted as it sounds, yes, they had to leave the scene in with the group hug and Jean with the gems because it was necessary for narratively how they would get to the tree. Logistically, it had to be left in, but the scene of RWBY's team reacting to her choice is technically not as important. That subplot suffered immensely, but it kind of was necessary, and we shouldn't hold any of these decisions against the writers who were forced to axe those scenes, but rather the people higher up who gave them the axe and told them, you have to cut a hell of a lot, you have to cut the subplots that aren't logistically necessary, and just leave Volume 9 to bare bones what it has to be. And so I am going to now transition into talking about the different behind the scenes cuts and changes and trivias and things about basically everything else we have learned about Volume 9 from the crew commentary, because I have sort of been the main character of RWBY Twitter for like a week, because I was lucky enough to receive the Volume 9 Blu-ray about 5 days early than it should have been given to me, because I pre-ordered it from Right Stuff Anime, the first place that had opened its Blu-ray pre-orders. So I've now spent about the last week sharing notes from the crew commentary as well as the concept art that was revealed on the Blu-ray. And now I will go through the various notes from the commentary that I think are the most important to share. I am linking to the Google Doc with all of my notes in the description if you want to read anything. Also, feel free to pause this video to read the notes that are on screen if you need to. As for Chapter 1, RWBY and the others were supposedly all in the know about John killing Penny when Weiss told them at the end of the chapter, and it happened off-screen. Head writer Eddy Rivas has already owned up to this miscommunication, that was communicated off-screen, and this has started some discourse about how RWBY never outwardly acknowledges that John did that, and Eddy pointed out that the writers never intended for RWBY to blame John for doing that, because the point of RWBY's narrative is that she blames everything on herself as the leader, and that RWBY does kind of outwardly deal with that. It's just that it's never quite expressed because it was meant to be communicated off screen. But it is that the weight of the badge and the burden as a leader is, what RWBY has always put the pressure and blame all on herself, even before Volume 9, but especially in Volume 9.
What's been interesting watching the audience kind of react to this is the thought that like Weiss didn't tell everything to RWBY, which it's an unfortunate side effect of we try not to repeat information on screen that we don't have to, but if someone's hiding something, we also try to show that moment that they choose to hide it, where the idea was that everybody was on the same page.
Yeah, that when we came in on this, it is tough, yeah.
As far as Chapter 2 goes, Eddy flat out states that Team RWBY and company did not make the right decisions in Atlas. It's kind of a recurring theme among their critics of the community that the writing is supposedly framing Team RWBY's decisions in Atlas as in the right, which I never quite understood. So it's nice to have it from the horse's mouth that really Volume 8, Volume 7 don't frame it like that at all. And the overall Atlas arc narrative was about Team RWBY and company doing what they thought was right, but making mistakes in doing that, and now growing from them. Now for Chapter 3, this was one of the more significant cuts for early on. The acre that Neo landed in and made her manor in was where the brothers experimented. The crew thought that it was super important early on to leave that kind of thing in, but as they went along, they started kind of leaning toward the fact that it would make enough sense without the audience knowing that, so they didn't quite need to include that, the fact that, like, the brothers kind of powered up Neo and that it wasn't entirely a semblance evolution type of thing, but the magic of the acre sort of kind of contributed to it as well. That being said, it does flow well enough as just being a semblance evolution. Doesn't need to be the brothers. Now for Chapter 4 notes, Miles had caught wind that people had interpreted the cat's dialogue as making fun of the critics for what they've critiqued about RWBY in the past. However, in fact, those lines of dialogue were more Miles calling himself out because he's the one who wrote all of those things. Miles is the one who wrote Chapter 4, he's the one who wrote the cat's dialogue, and he's writing the cat to call himself out because he's now had to feel the struggle of having to write with all of the problems that he has created for himself, and, well, the other writers too. Now for Chapter 5, Jean's clock tree, which, well, was revealed in Chapter 6, and an alligator ringmaster Afterin were cut from the Lotus Marketplace. The alligator was supposed to tend to the clock tree and noticed that a clock was missing and cried giant crocodile tears. And we, the audience, wouldn't have known that about Jean yet, so we would sort of pity the alligator in the moment, but then later, this alligator was supposed to be what the cat coerced to fight the Jabberwocker, but it became the Hawker during production. Carey said that the alligator Afterin was cut to help ease the stress on the production. He said that it was a very complex rig and they as a production had to pick their battles, so ultimately this alligator Afterin was cut. Now for Chapter 6, Carey says that Blake has identified in-universe as bisexual for a while, but before the bridge scene, Yang was still discovering her sexuality in a sense, and that's part of why Yang says, "I think I love you." Here is an audio clip of exactly what Carey had said about both of their sexualities.
Blake has been, bisexual for the longest time to her. Like I'm talking about like from a character perspective, and I think maybe what has taken this little while, one because we wanted just to feel right, but two is I think this is something that's new for Yang.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And she's realizing something about herself.
Yeah.
Now moving on to Chapter 8, the damage on Ruby's body as she's being beaten was originally a lot worse, but they toned it down. And Chapter 8 suffered a lot of cuts. They said that the two specific areas where these cuts happened most were at the very beginning, which is the part where Ruby walks in her lonesome to the manor, and the part where these characters were beating and berating Ruby. So the physical abuse was supposed to go on for longer, and Clover and Lionheart were supposed to be a part of it too. And lastly, Chapter 8 was supposed to end the moment where Ruby falls. Chapter 9 was supposed to start immediately afterwards with what comes after with Neo's possession, and the scene with the genial gems was supposed to be relatively in the middle of the episode of Chapter 9, not at the very beginning. The crew says that between the possession scene and the genial gems is kind of where these substantial cuts were made, and it is very likely that in that scene is where Team RWBY would have reacted to Ruby's choice, and so that's kind of where we lost out on that. There is a point in Chapter 9 where Kiersey insinuates that the exact nature of how it cuts back and forth between the fight and Ruby inside the tree was different from whatever original plans they had for any cuts in that scene. And Chapter 9 was originally supposed to end with the cat saying that they had put the others in the ground, right? That line of, "then I'll put you in the ground," was where the chapter was supposed to end. There was originally also a line before Ruby ascended where the herbalist would tell John that humans have everything that they need to change themselves, and John was supposed to say she already had everything she needed instead of Ruby knew what she needed to be all along. So there was a bit of a dialogue change there. As for Chapter 10, Eddy and Carey nod to how the brothers' lore dump at the end of the episode will be important later, but they kind of skirt around giving any details as to how. And lastly, we know that John reverting in age is a contentious thing for the audience as to whether it felt right or not, and it was also contentious in the writer's room. Eddy and Kiersey point out how the writer's room was divided on that idea. And those are all the most noteworthy things from the crew commentary. If you want to ask me what the crew had to say about a certain character or plot point, I would suggest heading over to the Google Doc and seeing if it's in there. Or, as well, listening to the crew commentary for yourself and, well, seeing that. They did have more to say about Ruby and John's mental states lashing out at each other in Chapter 7, and they do talk about Summer, Raven, Neo, and somewhat as well in Chapter 10. And again, I want to stress that hopefully the crew commentary has shed light on just how much of Volume 9's troubles aren't necessarily on part of the writers, that the things that the tail end of the volume volume would have been addressed if only they were given the money and the budget that they were originally thought they had in the first place. But people higher up than them are more at fault for the faults of Volume 9 because they're the ones who yanked the money away from the crew, and the crew had to do what they could with the money that they had left. So it's not the kind of thing that the writers or the production should have ever needed to prepare for, because how could they be at fault for what Volume 9 suffered for when they had no idea that would be coming, when they thought they had the money to do it? But they just didn't. It was yanked away from them. But that's all for now. That's everything that I think is the most salient for what Volume 9 struggled with behind the scenes, other sort of tidbits about what got cut. So like and subscribe to stay up to date for any other major RWBY news, like for instance, Volume 10 getting greenlit. Otherwise, I personally expect this channel to stay dormant for quite a while outside of 1 or 2 specific videos that I have coming up. That's just how it is for my life right now. But in any case, I will see you next time. I'm Robin Rising. Have a good one.